What is up, guys, and welcome back to the channel, where we make the absolute chaos of the global economy actually make sense for your wallet. If you have walked into a grocery store lately and felt like crying over the price of eggs, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We are living through some wild financial history right now, with interest rates doing gymnastics and inflation eating our paychecks like a hungry Pac-Man. But here is the secret that Wall Street suits don't usually say out loud. The economy isn't some mystical, unpredictable beast that just happens to us. It is actually just a simple machine, like a car engine or a toaster. And if you understand the parts, you can predict the ride. Today, we are remixing Ray Dalio's legendary economic machine theory, but we are ditching the textbook jargon and applying it to the reality of 2026. We are going to break this down so you finally understand why your mortgage rate is sky high and why money feels so tight right now. So, grab your overpriced coffee, smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm, and let's dive into the mechanics of how this beast actually works. At its core, the economy is just millions of simple things happening over and over again, driven by human nature and creating three main forces. These three forces are productivity growth, the short-term debt cycle, and the big scary one, the long-term debt cycle, which we will get to later. But before we talk about debt and crashes, we have to start with the simplest building block of the entire system, the humble transaction. Every time you buy a Chipotle burrito or pay your Netflix subscription, you are creating a transaction, and that is the heartbeat of the economic machine. A transaction is simple. You give money or credit to a seller, and they give you a good, a service, or a financial asset. That is it. Deal done. And when you add up every single transaction happening globally every day, you get the thing we call the economy. Now, here is the math part. But don't worry, it is fifth grade math. Money spent plus credit spent equals total spending in the economy. If you want to know the price of anything, you just take that total spending and divide it by the total quantity of goods sold. This formula is crucial because it explains why house prices went parabolic recently. Too much money and credit chasing too few houses equals high prices. The biggest player in this game is the government, which is actually two different people, the central government and the central bank, or the Fed. The government collects your taxes and spends money on roads and the military, but the central bank is the one controlling the flow of money. Think of the central bank as the mechanic adjusting the fuel injection. They control interest rates and print new money to keep the machine running. But the real juice, the gasoline that makes the economy roar and eventually crash, isn't cash. It is this magical thing called credit. Credit is the most important part of the economy, and honestly, it is the part that gets people like our friends Joe and Sarah into trouble. Let's introduce Joe and Sarah, a typical couple trying to navigate this economy, maybe looking to buy their first home or start a small business. When Joe goes to the bank to borrow money, he creates credit. He promises to pay the principal plus interest later, and the bank creates an asset. Here is the mind-blowing part. Most of what people call money in the United States isn't actual physical cash. It is actually just credit. In a typical economy, there might be $3 trillion in actual cash, but $50 trillion in credit floating around the system. Why does this matter? Because credit allows Joe and Sarah to spend more than they earn right now, which feels awesome in the short term. When Joe spends that borrowed money, someone else earns it. Because remember, one person's spending is another person's income in this machine. If Joe buys a house, the realtor, the builder, and the painter all get paid, and their income goes up, making them more creditworthy. Because their income went up, the bank looks at them and says, "Hey, you guys look good for a loan," and lends them even more money. They take that new loan, go out and spend it, which becomes someone else's income, and the cycle reinforces itself upward like a glorious spiral. This self-reinforcing pattern is what we call an economic expansion or a boom, and it feels like a party that is never going to end. But here is the catch, and it is a big one. You can't just borrow from your future self forever without eventually having to pay it back. Borrowing money is basically pulling consumption forward. You are buying stuff today by promising to buy less stuff in the future to pay it off. This dynamic creates a cycle. You spend a lot now, drive the economy up, but later you have to spend less, creating a downswing. Human nature creates these waves because we love the buy now part, but we really hate the pay later part of the equation. If there were no credit, the only way Joe could spend more is if Joe became more productive and actually earned more money. Productivity growth is a straight line. Sloping up over time, it's slow and steady, but credit makes the economy wiggle around that line in wild cycles. We have two major cycles to worry about: the short-term debt cycle, lasting 5 to 8 years, and the massive long-term debt cycle, lasting 75 years. Right now, Joe and Sarah are feeling the heat because we are at a tricky point in both of these cycles simultaneously. Let's zoom into the short-term debt cycle first, which is what dictates whether you can afford a car loan or a mortgage this year. In the expansion phase, credit is easy, Joe gets his loan, spending increases, and because supply can't keep up, prices start to rise. When prices rise aggressively, we call it inflation, and the central bank hates inflation like a homeowner hates termites in the foundation. We saw this recently. Money was free, everyone bought everything, supply chains broke, and suddenly a used Toyota cost as much as a new Porsche. So the central bank, seeing these high prices, steps in and pulls the lever to raise interest rates to cool things down. This is the hangover phase. Higher rates mean the monthly payments on Joe's debt go up, so he has less cash for burritos. Since Joe is spending less, the local burrito shop owner earns less, and soon the shop owner cuts back on their own spending too. The whole system slows down, inflation hopefully drops, and if it slows down too much, we slide into what is called a recession. But usually, in a short-term cycle, once the recession hits and inflation is dead, the central bank cuts rates, and the party starts all over again. That is the game we have been playing for decades. Boom, bust, cut rates. Boom, bust, cut rates. Over and over again. However, there is a glitch in the matrix. Each time the cycle restarts, people end up with just a little bit more debt than before. Why? Because human nature is optimistic. We push the envelope, borrowing more during the good times and rarely paying it all the way down. Over decades, these debts pile up higher and higher, creating a massive mountain of leverage that eventually becomes too heavy to carry. This leads us to the long-term debt cycle, which is the scary monster that only wakes up every 75 to 100 years or so. In this long cycle, despite the ups and downs, lenders keep extending credit because assets like stocks and real estate seem to always go up. People feel rich, like Joe looking at his estimate and thinking he is a real estate mogul, so he borrows against his house to buy a boat. This creates a bubble, where debt levels rise way faster than income levels, but nobody cares because the asset prices are skyrocketing. But eventually, the debt burden gets so massive that even cutting interest rates to zero isn't enough to save the system. This happened in 1929, it happened in 2008, and some economists argue we are flirting with the end of another massive cycle right now. When this long-term peak hits, we enter a process called deleveraging. And trust me, it is way uglier than a standard recession. In a deleveraging, people cut spending, incomes fall, credit disappears, asset prices tank, and banks refuse to lend to anyone. Unlike a recession, the central bank can't just lower interest rates to fix it because rates are already at rock bottom. This is the stuck moment where the economy grinds to a halt, and Joe and Sarah realize their house isn't worth what they owe on it. It is a vicious cycle. Joe sells his assets to pay debt, but because everyone is selling, prices crash, making his remaining debt feel even heavier. So, what do policymakers do when the traditional tools fail and the entire system is locking up like a rusted engine? They have four levers they can pull to try and fix a deleveraging, and usually they end up using all of them. Lever one, spending cuts, also known as austerity, where people, businesses, and governments try to tighten their belts and stop bleeding cash. It sounds responsible, but remember, one person's spending is another's income, so austerity causes incomes to fall faster than debts can be paid off. Lever two, debt restructuring, which is a fancy way of saying banks and lenders agree to take less money just to get something back. This creates a haircut on assets. Your savings account might be safe, but the investment bank's value evaporates, causing massive deflationary pain. Lever three, wealth redistribution, where the government raises taxes on the rich to help fund the poor and fill the massive budget holes. As you can imagine, this creates tension between the haves and the have-nots, leading to the kind of populism and social anger we see today. And finally, lever four, the one politicians love the most because it is the easiest to do, printing money out of thin air. The central bank creates new money to buy financial assets and government bonds, hoping to pump liquidity back into the frozen system. We saw this in 2008, and we saw it on steroids in 2020. The Fed's balance sheet exploded to keep the economy from collapsing. The key to a beautiful deleveraging, as Ray Dalio calls it, is balancing the deflationary pain of austerity with the inflationary joy of printing money. If they print too much, you get hyperinflation like Germany in the 1920s. If they print too little, the economy spirals into a depression. It is a tightrope walk over a canyon. And right now, we are watching the world's central bankers trying not to fall off. So bringing it back to Joe and Sarah in 2026, they are stuck navigating the aftermath of all that money printing from the last few years. The cash injection saved the system, but it also spiked asset prices, making houses unaffordable and keeping inflation sticky. We are in that transition period where the free money era is over and the pay the piper era is starting to ramp up. Understanding where we are in this cycle is the difference between making smart moves with your money or getting crushed by the machine. You have to watch the debt burdens relative to income and watch what the policymakers are doing with those four levers I mentioned. If interest rates stay high, asset prices usually have to come down, or incomes have to rise massive amounts to catch up. That is why the housing market feels so frozen. Sellers are clinging to yesterday's prices, and buyers are crushed by today's rates. But remember, the machine keeps churning. Productivity growth eventually wins out if you zoom out far enough on the timeline. The goal isn't to be scared of the machine. It is to recognize the weather patterns so you know whether to bring an umbrella or sunscreen. In the next part, we are going to dive deeper into how you can spot the turning points and what indicators to watch. We will also talk about how the rise of new technologies might impact productivity and potentially save us from the debt burden. But for now, just remember, your spending is someone else's income, and debt is just borrowing from your future self. Keep your eyes on the Fed. Watch the employment numbers. And don't over-leverage yourself hoping for a bubble that might have already popped. Thanks for tuning into this deep dive on the economic machine. Hopefully, the news makes a little more sense now. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss part 2, where we get into the nitty-gritty of surviving the cycle. See you guys next time. Welcome back to part 2, where we stop looking at the economy as a scary monster and start seeing it as a predictable machine. In part 1, we left Joe and Sarah staring at a mountain of debt while the central bank tried to juggle inflation and a recession. Now, we need to talk about what happens when that juggling act fails and the long-term debt cycle really hits the fan. This is the part of the movie where the hero gets knocked down. And in economic terms, we call this the depression phase. A depression isn't just a bad recession. It is when the rules of the game fundamentally change because interest rates are no longer effective. When we hit this wall, people like Joe stop spending entirely, businesses go bust, and the unemployment line wraps around the block. But here is the critical pivot. How the government handles this mess determines if we get a lost decade or a beautiful deleveraging. A beautiful deleveraging sounds like an oxymoron, like jumbo shrimp, but it is the holy grail of macroeconomic management. It happens when the policymakers balance the deflationary pain like bankruptcy with the inflationary medicine of printing money perfectly. If they get it right, debt burdens go down relative to income, economic growth stays positive, and inflation isn't a problem. But if they get it wrong, like Germany did in the 1920s printing wheelbarrows of cash, money becomes worthless toilet paper. Or if they do too little, like the US in the early 1930s, the whole system collapses into a deflationary black hole. Right now, in 2026, we are seeing governments terrified of deflation, so they are leaning hard on that print money button. This brings us to a massive realization. The economic machine doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates inside an empire. This is where Ray Dalio's research gets even spicier, connecting the machine to the rise and fall of empires. You see, Joe and Sarah's ability to borrow cheap money depends entirely on whether their country holds the reserve currency. A reserve currency status, like the US dollar has had since World War II, is the ultimate cheat code for a national economy. It allows a country to print money that the rest of the world accepts, effectively exporting their inflation to other countries. But history shows us that this privilege is not permanent. It moves in a cycle that lasts about 250 years, give or take. We saw it with the Dutch guilder in the 1600s, the British pound in the 1800s, and now we are watching the US dollar story play out. Just like the debt cycle, empires rise and fall based on a predictable set of cause and effect relationships. Dalio identified 8 key metrics that measure the vital signs of an empire, and they function like a health checkup for a nation. Let's run through them quickly so you can see exactly where we stand on the scoreboard today. First up is education. Before an empire becomes dominant, its people get smart, creating a foundation for everything else. Second is innovation and technology. Smart people invent things, ships, steam engines, or in our case, AI and the internet. Third is competitiveness. Because of that tech, the country produces goods cheaper and better than anyone else globally. Fourth is economic output. You sell those competitive goods, and the nation gets rich, boosting its GDP massively. Fifth is share of world trade. You become the Amazon.com of nations. Everyone buys from you, and your fleets rule the trade routes. Sixth is military strength. You need big guns to protect those trade routes, so you build the world's most powerful army. Seventh is financial center. Because you are rich, everyone brings their money to your banks, like New York or London. And finally, eighth, the reserve currency status, which is the lagging indicator, the prize you get for winning all the other categories. But here is the tragedy of the cycle. The things that make an empire rich eventually make it fat, lazy, and expensive. As Joe and Sarah's country becomes the top dog, their labor becomes more expensive, so companies outsource jobs to cheaper rivals. The people get used to being rich, they lose their competitive edge, and they start betting on the good times continuing forever. They borrow massive amounts of money, remember the debt bubble? Mostly to consume, not to invest in productive things like factories. This is the peak phase. The empire looks powerful on the outside, but the financial rot is spreading on the inside. Meanwhile, a rival power, let's call them the challenger, is hungry, working harder, and copying the dominant power's technology. The challenger starts scoring higher, on education, innovation, and trade, slowly eating the dominant empire's lunch. Back home in the dominant empire, the wealth gap explodes because the financial boom benefits the asset owners, not the workers. This leads to internal conflict, political polarization, populism, and anger, which makes decision-making paralyzed. Does that sound familiar? Because if you look at the news in 2026, it feels like we are ticking every single box on this checklist. When the dominant power is weakened by internal fighting and bad finances, the challenger tests them with external conflicts. These conflicts don't have to be shooting wars. They can be trade wars, technology wars, or geopolitical standoffs. The dominant power then faces a terrible choice: fight to defend its position and risk bankruptcy, or retreat and lose influence. It is the classic guns versus butter dilemma. Do we spend money on the military to fight rivals, or on social programs to calm the angry population? Usually, empires try to do both, which leads to, you guessed it, more money printing and faster devaluation of the currency. This is the danger zone where the reserve currency status starts to wobble, and investors begin looking for a safer exit. If the world loses faith in the currency, the empire loses its ability to borrow cheaply, and the decline accelerates rapidly. So, putting the economic machine and the empire cycle together gives us the ultimate roadmap for what comes next. We are likely in the decline phase of the dominant power and the rise phase of a challenger, with a lot of debt friction in between. But don't panic. Knowing this doesn't mean you should build a bunker and buy canned beans. Well, maybe a few beans. It means you need to understand that the normal of the last 40 years, falling rates and U.S. dominance, might not be the normal of the future. The transition period, which Dalio says takes 10 to 20 years, is volatile, messy, and full of sharp corrections. For Joe and Sarah, this means their strategy needs to shift from passive optimism to active defense. You cannot just rely on a standard 60/40 stock bond portfolio if both stocks and bonds are hit by inflation and rising rates. You have to look for assets that can survive the currency devaluation, things that are real, tangible, and scarce. This is why you see billionaires buying farmland, gold, and commodities. They are hedging against the currency losing its value. But it is not all doom and gloom. Remember, these cycles create massive opportunities for those who see the turn coming. New technologies, specifically AI and robotics, act as a deflationary force that fights against the inflationary money printing. If productivity explodes because of AI, it could actually bail us out of the debt crisis by making everything cheaper. That is the wild card in our deck for 2026. Can we innovate our way out of this debt hole before the empire cycle drags us down? It is a race between the old economy debt burden and the new economy productivity boom. As an investor, or just a regular person trying to pay bills, you are essentially betting on which force wins the tug of war. In the final part of this series, we are going to break down the specific winners and losers of this new world order. We will talk about which countries are rising, which sectors are safe, and how to position your own personal balance sheet. We will also simplify the big cycle into a checklist you can use to evaluate the news headlines every morning. Because once you see the pattern, conflict, peace, prosperity, bubble, bust, revolution, you can never unsee it. It stops being chaos and starts being history repeating itself. And that gives you the power to act. So take a breath, digest the fact that empires aren't forever, and get ready to strategize. The world is changing, but change is the only thing that creates progress, provided you survive the transition. We are going to wrap this up in part 3 with actionable steps, so you aren't just smart, you are prepared. Stick around, because the conclusion is going to tie everything, Joe. The Fed, the empires, and your wallet together. All right, welcome to the final round, part 3. Where we stop admiring the problem and start building the solution. We've talked about the debt machine and the crumbling empires. But now the million-dollar question is, what do Joe and Sarah actually do? In periods of massive change like this, there is always a massive transfer of wealth from those who are asleep to those who are awake. You do not want to be the bag holder holding on to assets that worked in the last cycle but are toxic in the new one. So let's identify the losers first. Sadly, it is usually people holding cash or fixed income bonds in a declining currency. If the government is printing money to inflate away its debt, your savings account is basically an ice cube melting in the sun. The other big loser is the person who is 100% dependent on the old economy without any skills relevant to the new economy. Now let's talk about the winners. These are the people who own scarce assets, adaptable skills, or businesses with pricing power. Pricing power is key. If inflation hits, can your business raise prices without losing customers? If yes, you win. So, step one of your survival kit is a radical rethink of diversification. It's not just buying different U.S. stocks anymore. True diversification in a changing world order means having exposure to assets and currencies outside of the declining empire. Look at emerging markets that have strong balance sheets, young populations, and aren't drowning in the same debt crisis we are. Step two is the hard asset hedge. You need a slice of your portfolio in things that central banks cannot print. This is why gold has survived for 5,000 years. It is the cockroach of finance. It survives every empire collapse. Whether you believe in gold or its digital cousin Bitcoin, the point is to have insurance against the currency being debased. But don't go overboard and become a doomsday prepper living in a bunker. You still need growth. Which brings us to step three. Invest in the productivity miracle. The companies building the AI, the robots, and the tech that solves the labor shortage. Remember, productivity is the only force that can actually fight the debt cycle and win in the long run. Step four is personal. You are your own biggest asset. So treat your skills like a stock portfolio. In a volatile economy, job security doesn't come from a contract. It comes from having skills that are in high demand globally. If Joe learns how to leverage AI in his workflow, he becomes 10x more productive and inflation-proofs his own salary. Now, I want to give you a daily checklist to help you filter the noise when you open your news app in the morning. When you see a headline, ask yourself, is this a symptom of the internal cycle or the external cycle? If you see Fed prints billions, that is the debt cycle trying to deleverage, expect asset prices to wiggle. If you see trade war escalates or sanctions imposed, that is the empire cycle challenging the old order. By categorizing the news, you stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically, like a general looking at a map. The history of the world is just a history of these cycles repeating. From Rome to the Dutch to the British to us. It sounds scary, but remember, the world didn't end when the British pound lost its reserve status. The game just changed. Opportunities shifted from London to New York, just like they are shifting from west to east or into the digital realm today. Your job is to be nimble, to stay liquid enough to pounce on opportunities, but hedged enough to sleep at night. Don't get locked into a 30-year view based on the last 30 years. Be ready for a decade that looks completely different. Keep your debt low, keep your skills high, and keep your eyes on the liquidity flows of the central banks. We are going to get through this, and frankly, there has never been a more exciting time to be paying attention. The economic machine is grinding its gears, but for the mechanic who knows how it works, it is a beautiful thing to watch. If you found value in this deep dive, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button so we can survive the next cycle together. Drop a comment below. Do you think we are in a beautiful deleveraging, or are we heading for a crash? I want to hear your take. Thanks for watching, stay safe, invest smart, and I will see you guys in the next episode.